and welcome to the Rural Press Club of Queensland's first luncheon event for 2022. My name is Fran Becker. I'm an agribusiness lawyer at Hamilton Locke and I'm Vice President of the club. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. A special welcome today to Member for Callide Colin Boyce and the Honourable Larry Anthony, as well as some of our committee members on the Rural Press Club. Wendy Brownscombe, Caro Martin, Will Banks, Michael Blakeney, John Burke, James Nason, Mark Neville and Mark Phelps. I'm standing in today for our President, Stacey Wordsworth, who is unfortunately unwell. I know Stacey is devastated to not be here in the room with you all today, but we look forward to seeing her back at our March event. It's really fantastic to be back for another year. A year where there is still COVID, but one in which we don't have the restrictions that stopped us from running events over the past couple of years. We are back with a bang. We have a sold-out crowd of more than 300 people here today at the Pullman Hotel, which is housing us this month while our regular venue is renovated. So, on behalf of the committee, our warmest welcome to you. Thank you for turning out to support our event today and what we hope will be the beginning of a very big year for the club. In fact, we know it will be a big year because in 2022, the Rural Press Club of Queensland will celebrate an extremely important milestone, and that is we will be celebrating our 50th anniversary. It's a big birthday. We've come a long way in 50 years, and there are many people in the room here today who have contributed to that by being on the committee or continually attending and supporting our events and what we do. We will talk to you much more about our history as we head towards our birthday in July, when we are planning a very special event. But today's presentation is really all about the future and one of the most talked about topics in agriculture right now, carbon. Many of you will have patiently held your tickets over from last July when we first planned to present Managing Director of Corporate Carbon, Gary Wyatt. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way of that event, and in the time since, we have decided to extend the format of the presentation, given the overwhelming interest expressed in this particular topic, and the conversation that is happening right now across agriculture value chains, from grassroots to consumers, to corporate Australia, and certainly in political circles and policy making. So today, we are delighted to present a panel of speakers with varied and vast experience across the carbon space. Joining Gary Wyatt today will be Naomi Wilson, who is Head of Environment and Sustainability at AACO, James Henderson, grazier, former Chair of the AgForce Young Producers Council and who now sits on the AgForce Council, and our facilitator for today, Pip Courtney from ABC Landline. A very warm welcome to each of our speakers. As always, we must sincerely thank our home paddock sponsors, McCullough Robertson Lawyers and Colliers Agribusiness and Sun Super for their ongoing support of the club and of Queensland agriculture. We welcome each of these wonderful organisations back for another exciting year in 2022. If you happen to be tweeting today, please use the hashtag RPCCarbon, but for now, please enjoy your lunch. Thank you. Now to today's important discussion on carbon. I'd like to welcome our panel, including Gary Wyatt, who's Managing Director at Corporate Carbon. Gary is a former commodity trader specialising in energy and environmental markets. He oversees varied projects, including many across Queensland and New South Wales, dedicated to reducing the emission of beef herds while growing productivity. He works with farmers on building soil carbon in the field to selling carbon credits to governments and companies. We have today Naomi Wilson, the Head of Environment and Sustainability at AACO. Naomi has been working in sustainable agriculture for more than 25 years In 2016, Naomi joined AOCO and recently took a leading role in the development of the company's sustainability framework. During her time with AOCO, Naomi has worked with technology partners to develop industry-first satellite tools for measuring pasture biomass. Our third speaker is James Henderson, who's a grazier and an AgForce board council member. With his wife Kylie and their 3 children, James runs a breeding and background operation over 3 properties in the North Burnett and Central Queensland regions. The family has 2 carbon farming projects on their breeding property, which have significantly grown business revenue. And Pip Courtney, who really needs no introduction. Pip is an acclaimed journalist and has presented ABC Landline since 2012, but has spent more than, how many years, Pip? Many years reporting at the ABC. She is multi-award winning, having been successful at the likes of the Clarion Awards and the International Federation of Agricultural Journalist Awards, as well as our very own Rural Press Club of Queensland's Rural Journalism Awards. She's a former Rural Press Club committee member and an inductee into our Journalism Hall of Fame, and she has reported extensively on carbon farming. Carbon is a complex space. There are many opinions, unknowns, opportunities and challenges. So we'll hand over to Pip and our panel to guide the conversation from here.
Just checking that this is on.
Is that on? Can everyone hear?
Great, thank you. Well, the fact that this session is sold out with over 300 people shows how high the interest in carbon is. Farmers can build carbon in the soil to improve sustainability and production, all with the end goal of selling credits for a new income stream, which James is going to tell us all about. They can plant trees, quarantine bushland from clearing, or go into the market themselves and buy offsets to improve their operations' carbon footprint. Either way, all the farmers in this audience and beyond have a new language to learn. It's complex, but so are many other markets that farmers operate in. It's just another thing that they're going to have to get their head around, and those who do the work alone or with the help from outside experts will be ahead of the game. And not only will they not get ripped off, they won't make decisions now, which could turn out to be the wrong ones in 10 to 20 years' time. So I'd like to kick off today with 2 numbers, which will become more important as the years go on. And this is going to go to you, Gary. The price of an Australian carbon credit unit, or ACCU, you can tell us what you call it, and the global price. So what is it? What are those prices today?
Maybe I'll start by answering that, not about today's price, but the price that if we had been having this lunch when it was originally planned in July of last year, in the high teens, so $18, $19 a tonne. And as we sit here today, a little bit north of $50 a tonne. So that's per tonne of CO2, carbon dioxide, either avoided from being emitted or sequestered, removed from the atmosphere. So just a bit north of $50 a tonne.
What does that price rise tell us about the world that you work in?
Look, the main thing it tells us is the perception, the global view of climate change and what needs to be done about it is really becoming an unavoidable problem, and it's now front of mind. So, a year ago or maybe 5 years ago, climate action was really driven by government policy, but I think what we see now is that it's reached a point in public perception that it's something that needs to be dealt with. And the cost, $50 a tonne, is just a reflection of what it's going to cost to deal with that. A little bit earlier you asked about international prices. Those vary widely, but in Europe, which is probably the most advanced economy we see in kind of tackling these climate problems, it's a little bit north of $140 a tonne. So that kind of gives us an indication of the kind of prices that are probably going to have to be paid to really deal with this issue.
So which one should farmers be watching? The global price or the Australian price? Or like the New Zealand price last November was $65 NZ, 64 euro in Europe and £54 in the UK. So what numbers should farmers be looking at?
I would think local farmers absolutely interested in the market they can access. It doesn't help particularly much if wheat prices in the US are way above Australian prices. It's like, what market can we access? And for local producers, it's really the Australian carbon price. So that $50 a tonne, that's a market that's there and can be accessed by them immediately.
And what is going to happen to this price in your view? Get out the crystal ball, but as the drive in all countries to hit net zero by 2050 intensifies, will the price go up, then up again, then up again?
Look, I think if you take a broad long-term outlook, prices are likely to go up, and it's just what will it cost to decarbonise an economy. In the short term, there's going to be a whole lot of fluctuations. I guess everyone in this room is used to things like that. In the very short term, we'll probably look at, government policy is a large driver of carbon pricing, and there will be some policy uncertainty as we go through a federal election. So, that could introduce, some volatility, swings up and down, but really over the long term, the price outlook looks positive.
Gary, who buys carbon credits?
Everyone. No. In Australia, it's kind of at the moment, at the current policy settings, the federal government is the largest buyer. But that's changed, really significantly over probably the last 12 months, maybe the last 24 months. And it's one of the reasons why we've seen this ramp up in prices, where we've seen 3 other buyers into the market where they were kind of completely absent before. And probably the most important and interesting one has just been investor buyers in carbon. So buyers entering the market, buying carbon credits because they believe the price is too cheap and it will go up, and they'll earn a return over time. The other 2 buyers that are also there is corporate buyers that are taking voluntary action, so for their sustainability goals. Now, that's probably less voluntary than it seems, because their shareholders are demanding it, regulators are demanding it, stock exchanges are demanding it, but certainly there's that kind of voluntary buyer. And then finally, there's compliance buyers, so large limited corporations that are kind of forced under Australian rules, regulations, laws to cover or offset some of their emissions. They're also there buying.
Well, James, how many carbon projects do you have underway, and can you describe what they are?
Yeah, so we've got 2 carbon farming projects. One is an avoidance one, and one's a sequestration one. So we've got a small, it's called the Water Clearing Project. That's essentially where our forest on our Category X country has met the international definition of forest, which is 2 metres in height, 20% canopy. Obviously, it's a lot taller than that. And we're essentially getting paid not to knock that down. It's an avoidance. The other project, a more significant one, is a human-induced regeneration one. That's a HIR. We're essentially getting paid to grow a forest. And we have the records and the data to demonstrate a management action change on farm. That this wasn't business as usual. To meet additionality requirements. This is where it does get technical, and I'll try and stay out of the weeds. But
we have a safe word, but when we get in the weeds, I'll tell you what it is.
So essentially, we're getting paid to grow a forest. Now, probably the important thing to recognise about this is not instead of beef. We are fully overlapping our projects. So everywhere we have carbon, we have beef. And what we could demonstrate even before we started our projects is that our carbon projects would have 0 impact on our beef production. Mostly because we prepared the right methodology with ourselves. So we knew what methodology to do on what country and how to design our project to maximise it. And to give you an example of where that sits with us now, if we, in our next round of reporting, if we manage to get $50 a tonne, I'm hoping we will, our gross dollars per hectare will be higher than our beef production, even at the current beef price.
And that is the sort of 8-second grab every journalist loves, but I'm sure there'll be some beef producers in the audience who would love to hear that, because I think at the start it was all peppercorn sort of payments, and really the benefits were in building a more sustainable operation, improving your soils and biodiversity. So it's a proper income stream now for you.
Yeah, very much. It sits in our cash book. Our bank's very positive about it, which makes things easier. Conversation with the bank, our bank was very positive about it, and that made life very easy. And it just becomes part of what you do. And when you go into the paddock and you manage that system, you're not just managing a beef system, you're managing a beef system, a carbon system. We also got a forestry angle on our property, so at the end of the 25 years, under that methodology, we'll have the rights back to that timber, and we'll be looking to harvest a high value forest. So we'll get sort of a second bite of the cherry, if you will. But that's just all about, using those methodologies to your advantage as a producer, but you need to understand them very well, and you need to have either excellent skill yourself or some technical expertise to get you through that.
Well, that was my next question. I went down the methodology rabbit hole on the internet last night and again this morning, and I wanted somebody to just come and throw a bucket of cold water on me and say, stop looking, stop it. But how difficult was it getting your head around the market and then deciding what you were going to do?
Very difficult. We went to the very first carbon farming forum, and it was in Monte Shoal Hall in 2011. We started talking to carbon companies in 2014. We didn't execute till start of 2017. So it wasn't something you just go, oh, we're going to go do this. And that process was about understanding the market, the methodology. We needed time for the carbon companies to evolve. They just weren't there. For all their faults, they actually did have a place in setting that market up. How they, their business model now and how they operate on, probably a good question. But ultimately, they served a very good purpose for us in the early days.
Okay. Now, Gary, if we look at building soil carbon, is it easier for farmers in wetter areas like Tas, Vic, Southern WA, and where farms are smaller, so it's easier to go and do your soil samples? Is it easier for people in those areas to keep the bigger skulls?
I'll maybe put it like this. The returns to soil carbon are pretty easier to see, quicker to realise in more productive systems. So certainly in higher rainfall areas, smaller properties, where the inputs are more intensive, management is more intensive, you kind of see the results quicker. Now, I think what's happening in the industry is those techniques are being developed and honed there. But over time, as the techniques get better and better, they're being expanded out geographically into kind of more challenging systems. So, I think quite quickly it'll expand, or the opportunities there will expand into, less productive systems, much larger farms. And certainly technology is going to play a large role in that. So a lot of investments going into technology to bring down things like measurement, verification costs. And so over time, we're going to see that as a really powerful project type across quite extensive properties. Not getting into the range, it's going to be challenging, but I think we'll get there eventually.
And guess who I'm leading into, Naomi? That'll be you. So, given you work for AACO, and given where the company's properties are in the north and the size of them, is soil carbon even an option for how AACO might deal with carbon and make some money out of it?
We see it as a very exciting option, actually. Just in terms of cost of sampling, it's been a significant barrier for us. So we operate across 6.4 million hectares in Northern Australia, with low infrastructure across that estate. If we were to do a baseline of our estate at the standard $20 a hectare for sampling, it cost us $128 million to do that sampling.
Did you all hear that? That wasn't a verbal typo. Yeah, $128 million.
So that makes it challenging. We can't engage in broad scale carbon sequestration at that sort of cost. So we've started a project through Food Agility with some additional partners in SIBO Labs and Carbon Link and Mullion Group, and some other universities to start to develop a satellite tool that estimates carbon at scale in the landscape, to start to bring down that cost for us. The other important component of that work is actually looking and building an understanding of what the potential is in Northern Australia, because that's the other barrier for us, is having reliable understanding of how soil carbon functions in those landscapes. And a good understanding of what the sequestration capacity is in Northern Australia. In addition to that, then understanding what we actually have to do differently in order to drive that sequestration through the landscape. So a significant part of that work is looking at what management changes we need to put in place to achieve that.
And do you have answers yet? Or are you working towards finding what the solutions are for a company with such a massive portfolio of properties?
We've had to think about what the answers might be, and we think the answers are pretty good, which is why we're continuing to work in that direction. We're seeing it as something that can potentially help us to drive improvement in how we manage our landscape, and help us to actually, derive more value out of, protecting the landscape and improving its condition over time.
So you're the person who's worked on this amazing sustainability document that's on AACO's website, which is great reading. But do you look at carbon and sequestration and maybe slowing down emissions as just running a better operation, or are you looking at is AACO looking at getting into the market and being a carbon trader, or just have better soils and better production?
We're looking at lots of things. So carbon we're seeing as being fundamental to our business and to our purpose as a company, as a significant land manager. When we think about carbon, we actually think about the broader landscape and our impact on nature. And our intention long term is to achieve a nature positive business where we're seeing improvements in land condition, improvements in productivity condition, and then diversifying income streams through that health of landscape. That also ties very directly back to our core business of producing beef. So we see our management practices in that landscape as being fundamental to how we drive that. So to answer your question, we see it sort of, weaving through everything that we're going to do as a business moving forward.
And James, you needed to go and get a consultant to give you a hand. Naomi, how have you found going out and looking for consultants? Have they been able to help AACO, or will you sort of build that capacity within the company?
So I think it's going to be a bit of a hybrid model for us. We will probably follow a different path to what James has followed, but consultants in the industry will certainly play a significant role for us as we develop our capacity. We think it's fundamental for us as a business, and we think it probably applies more broadly to the industry that we need to build our skills and capacity to actually manage carbon and nature as a core component of our business, and look at it as another commodity or product that we're producing, and in that context, know it inside out.
Well, James, it must be tempting to say, this is really hard to understand, I'll just get a consultant to do it, and then you just walk away. Is that how, would you say that that's perfectly okay? I mean, I get my tax man to do my very insignificant tax return and I don't think about it, but do farmers need to know the ins and outs of it, or know it properly, like they would know the market for wheat if they were wheat producing?
Yes, 100%. Back when we started, yes, we accessed the carbon company. That's how we did our project. Going forward, we've actually got our own company, Insular Landholders, where we do fee-for-service carbon projects because of what we've learned in the industry. Like, it's not impossible to learn. Like, you can get through it. That took, a group of 3 of us 5 years part-time. So it is, relatively complicated, but it's not impossible.
No, it's not.
But if you want to get, like when they talk about $50 a tonne, it's like saying the top price weaner at Rover was $2,000. There was a lot there at $1,500, so they don't talk about it. Carbon's a bit the same. Like there is some really good returns, and there's some really good methodologies that can be on certain areas, on certain properties, get some great results. But on the flip side of that, you've got to be a bit careful. Like I've seen a number of projects just because of producers going to a certain carbon company, they've got a certain type of project they do. They've started that project, and we've come in later on and said that's just the wrong project. Like, why did you do that methodology? You should have done this methodology. And it's only because that carbon company had a pet methodology and that was it, and no other reason. And there's no check and balance in that system. It's really up to the landholder to go and find the answers. And yeah, that's, I suppose that type of conversation is where we got to an AgForce, because we had a lot of members coming through saying, what's going on? This is a mess, how do I understand it? And we started working on our AgCare platform. That was one of the fundamental reasons we started that platform, was to address that issue initially, and then obviously, flow on the other environmental and ES&G sort of standards that are all coming at a million miles an hour.
Well, Gary, how do people pick somebody? Is it just like change the word carbon consultant to agronomist? I mean, people go out and choose agronomists, but do you just go with your gut feeling, recommendations? How do you avoid dealing with one of maybe the shysters or the people who just put up a shingle because they saw that there's a quid in it?
Maybe all of the above. Look, it's a relatively small industry. There are, because of what we've seen in prices and the kind of excitement around it, is attracting maybe some of that kind of, your term, shysters. So probably the starting point is there are some industry bodies, there are some quality control type things that would be maybe the first thing to look for. So, for example, there's a Carbon Market Institute, and that has a code of conduct, and that code of conduct is very specifically around protecting landholders. So, there's a big information asymmetry, and one of the things is building trust, but another is just working with someone that is kind of respected within the industry, and that would be referenced by that code of conduct.
And James, when you go to sell it, like you can't see it, well maybe you can, when you pick up a handful of soil, is it hard to imagine like what it is that you're actually selling?
Yeah, my father-in-law continually tells me I'm just selling air. And he still disagrees with it. But it doesn't mean you don't, like at the end of the day you get paid. Think of it as a share in a company. You don't physically see that share if you've got a share of the BHP building. You don't own that divine ore. And it's probably using an aggregator or a carbon company. It's more like in the share farming. That's probably a better way of looking at it. So it's a combination of share farming plus shares is sort of how that product is derived. Farmers often struggle to get their head around it because they measure it in a tonne, but it's a financial product. So that's really, you go, so what's an acre? It's a tonne of carbon. Oh, yeah, it's a tonne of carbon, but it's a financial product. That doesn't make any sense. I thought you said it was a tonne of carbon. And there's very good reasons it is the way it is, and that's what gives it the industry strength and integrity. But it also makes it very hard for people to wade through all those things they need to understand to get the most out of it, and to have those conversations with potential buyers or, particularly regulators and banks.
And Gary or James or Naomi can answer this. Is it a bit like superannuation? The earlier you get in, the better off you'll be. Like, would you say to farmers, don't avoid it, don't keep putting it off, get your head around it and get involved? Who'd like to answer that one? No?
Yeah, I agree. The sooner you start, the better off you'll be. The only caveat on that is make sure you're doing due diligence before you start. Certainly in terms of business improvement, so our carbon project that we currently have is around our efficiency as a business and avoided carbon as a result of that. For many farmers, improving your business efficiency is something that you do as a core part of your business. And so the sooner you engage in a methodology that pays you in addition for doing that, the better off you'll be. The longer you hold off on that, the more difficult it's going to be to get around additionality conditions and other factors that come with that methodology. So it certainly pays to enter sooner rather than later.
What's your thoughts on that, Gary?
Look, absolutely there is an incentive to become involved. Probably one of the biggest complaints or gripes that we hear from landholders is, this thing that you're asking me to do, I've been doing it for the last 10 years, are you going to come and give me credits for 10 years of good work I've done, and that's quite often a hard conversation because the answer is basically comes down to no. So, there is an incentive to jump in early, but having said that, these are quite long-term projects and they are long-term commitments, and they do require careful thought and planning. And there can be, if it's a rush driven by short-term focus, it can lead to regret down the line.
Yes, you did say that you could wake up 20 years down the line when we were talking the other day and realise you've made a mistake. That's a long time to be regretting something. Or a big wake-up call that you weren't expecting 20 years in.
Well, I think it's about understanding the implications and the risks as you go in. So, we'd probably say that's only going to happen if it was something that was unexpected. Now, you go into, make production choices all the time. And if you understand the variables of what's at stake, and you make the best decision you can at the time, well, you can't, there's always going to be regret down the line, but we don't have insight in how prices are going to move and things like that. But it's more about just making the best informed decision you can when you enter.
How many $1 trillion could this industry be worth right now?
Maybe I'm going to answer that in a roundabout way. We see carbon as just one step along a process of delivering a whole range of environmental services. And carbon is one environmental service, but there's others that we think over time are going to start to look more and more like carbon, in that there's a way for those services that landowners can deliver through good management practices to be monetized. So an example could be water quality. I'm sure James is involved in others too. But then, to answer your question as well, it becomes delivering these environmental services become an add-on to agricultural production. But maybe the answer to that is, well, at what percentage of the agricultural market could that get to? And we would think over time, we completely see a world where if you're a producer and 25% of your income isn't coming from delivering other services, environmental services, you're missing out and you're not running that operation as well as you could. So in answer, it could be a decent portion of the agricultural market.
Well, CSIRO have got a figure on it. It's $58 billion by 2050, $58 billion per year. So I think the Queensland beef industry is around 20 billion. So it gives you an idea.
And farmers could have a share of that in your view?
I think farmers should have the majority share of it, which is probably not quite happening the way that should at the moment. But the other thing that needs to happen, and it's not happening very much at the moment, is that conversation about those markets and that are emerging is really happening separate to agriculture. There is a very clear line that as someone who has fought high in the carbon world told me once in the early days, well, this doesn't really involve agriculture, does it? So, that's the attitude of some of the people putting this together. Agriculture you're just there to provide these services. We don't actually want your input. So that's really got to change. That's pretty disgraceful, I think. And obviously that's what we're pushing in the AgForce community with our AgCare platform. These are the things that really need to change. We've got a way to do it. We've just got to get it. The other thing that really needs to change is the way the government approaches is to get some more security around tenure. Because that's the biggest risk is to your tenure, to what's going to happen to your country at the end of the project. So some more written guarantees that at the end of the project you're not going to have a whole heap more regulation, because the way it stands, like at the end of our project, what could quite easily happen, we'll get by under the Nature Conservation Act, we'll get koala mapping, we'll get a whole heap of other levels of regulation that we don't have now, simply because we're going to the carbon project, which is not really desirable. So if you're from a government's point of view, you want to encourage these environmental markets, encourage stewardship and connectivity, because that's the key, connectivity across the landscape. Well, you need to do your bit to facilitate that and de-risk it for the farmer, because if you go to the bank, they'll tell you that's the risk. And you go, and it's not that hard of a thing to fix.
Are banks going to be looking at operations, like whether it's AACO or James, and saying, where are your carbon abatement programs and where is your carbon sequestration programs?
I think unquestionably, and I think they already are. And certainly, you know, in the next 10 years, it's going to become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for agricultural businesses to access finance for capital if they don't address not just carbon and climate impact, but sustainability more broadly. I think that's very clearly writing on the wall, and you know, it's a really strong driver for developing sustainability across agriculture.
And is that because the banks see a risk in that customer who hasn't sort of future-proofed themselves, or that it's a social licence thing for the banks to be wanting on their ledgers?
Well, I guess it's a combination of things, but there's certainly regulation that's going to drive that in the banking sector in terms of responsible investment. Mix of drivers.
So the beef industry has set a goal of carbon neutral by 2030, so 7 years to go. To the two beef producers on the panel, is that possible?
It is, yeah, absolutely. We already are. I'm very confident we already are. We just haven't developed the accounting method to demonstrate it. You know, the work we're doing with the AgForce platform and how you account for, you know, you're not trying to create a financial product, you're simply trying to account for what's in that system. Those accounting methodologies aren't really out there because they don't produce a product, so there's no demand for it. The industry needs to create those methodologies and those accounting systems to get the demand. There is a really, and Naomi and I were talking about this earlier, a really interesting fact is that consumers aren't willing to pay for a carbon neutral product. They simply expect it. There's no premium at the end of it. So the likes of our operation, you know, like we're about 2,000 tonnes, I think, was what we is our emissions. Under our AgCare model, we sequester about 9,000 tonnes. Our additionality projects, you know, pump out about, we sequester about 14,000 tonnes. But why would I use, you know, those credits that are worth $50 a tonne, you know, spend $100,000? I'm not going to get $100,000 premium for my beef. I don't see that in cattle. So I think the conversation around using ACCUs as a method for carbon neutrality, unless you're, you know, like AACO and you're a big vertical in the supply chain, like it might suit for them, but for most producers, it's just not going to be an option.
Naomi?
I think in terms of the 2030 target, you know, the potential is certainly there. There are a lot of challenges in that as well. There's a lot of uncertainty in the methods that we can use to get there and the technologies that we need to employ. There's also some significant uncertainty around the cost of implementing those methods, and particularly if you're looking at methods of, for example, for beef, for addressing methane emissions. There's going to be a significant cost for the industry in doing that. And if you can't get a premium for your product in return, it is going to make it a challenging proposition. But we don't think an insurmountable one. And there's a lot of work that we need to do moving forward to provide really solid science around the changes that we need to make in the industry and the technologies that we need to bring on board in order to deliver that 2030 target.
Seaweed. Is seaweed a silver bullet for the industry or not?
There's no silver bullet for the industry. Seaweed is a really promising technology that's emerging, but it's not going to address the issue in one hit. We see it as being, you know, a multiple and integrated approach to managing that, and the integration goes beyond, you know, directly trying to suppress the emissions into, you know, building efficiency and improvements in your breeding program and whatnot to achieve that goal.
Well, Gary, we mentioned before that you've got like 100 projects that you're overseeing. Can you give us an idea of a couple of them, just briefly, so people get an idea for what sort of things farmers are signing up for?
Sure. So, maybe the first step is just kind of define what we mean by a project. So really what it is identifying an activity that a landholder or a business could be doing to reduce or sequester carbon emissions. And to get credits from that project, you kind of have to notify the Clean Energy Regulator that you're going to undertake these activities. They register, they make a record of that, and you have to follow a whole lot of rules, like quite detailed set of rules, which are termed methodologies, which is what you've been getting into the weeds on.
I know one at home is playing a drinking game every time someone mentions the word methodology.
So the methodologies are just about the kind of rules that need to be followed for that type of activity. So there would be methodologies for the type of activities that James has been doing. So, for example, human-induced regeneration, or environmental plantings, or the management of methane emissions from beef herd. So each one of those has the detailed rules. Now, for the land sector in Australia, there's probably been just a small handful that have worked really well, and you've seen kind of most projects gravitate to those. So those are either been in broad sectors, been about vegetation, so you get growing additional vegetation, about soil carbon, getting the carbon back in the soils, about the management of beef herd, or the methane emissions from beef herd, and then maybe the kind of final one to mention, which has worked really well across Northern Australia, management of savanna wildfires. So those are kind of been the predominant ones for the land sector.
And if obviously 128 million hasn't been set aside for Naomi in the AACO budget to go and soil test every 50 metres, one of the other ways you can estimate soil carbon levels is using satellites. Now, various scientists have said to me those estimates can be incredibly flaky and could, if they turn out to not be accurate, then that reduces confidence in the system. Do you see coming down the pipe a solution to that? Or does Naomi need to go to accounting and say, I need $128 million, please?
I might ask them that anyway. You're quite right, there's lots of satellite technologies emerging in the market making claims that are questionable. And that's why we've partnered with some really smart people to bring a high level of integrity to that technology. And we've set standards that the product that we develop out of that must meet the high conditions that the Clean Energy Regulator will demand. So we're aiming to develop a strong and highly reliable product through that process.
And if you do the wrong thing, or do the cheap thing, or pick the wrong horse in terms of measurements, could you end up with junk credits that no one wants down the track? Will there be grades of credits?
Look, under Australian rules, that's pretty unlikely. To get a credit issued, it has to go through the federal regulator, which is the Clean Energy Regulator, and they really set quite high standards, like a very high bar to meet. So, once a project or an issuance has gone through the regulator, you can be pretty sure that the quality is baked in. Now, that comes with the downside is you're dealing with Canberra. It can be a long, difficult process. It requires things like auditing, etc. But the upside is there's a high degree of market acceptance in the quality of those credits. So once you finally through that process, there's absolute acceptance that those are good, high-quality credits. And I think that's one of the things that reflected in the price, is that the price reflects that level of trust that's kind of brought to by having a high degree of oversight.
And whether you want to sell your credits or not, James, do you end up with a more resilient, drought-proofed, climate change-proofed property? Like, take carbon out of the picture. Do you just end up running a better operation? And farmers are always looking for the 1%, 2%, 3%. Will this give it to you?
Yeah, very much. Look, we live in that. It's all about the 1%. We always talk about the 1% in our house. It's a very finely tuned beef operation, because that's what you need to run to stay in business. That's just the reality of the situation. Most people have got it. The co-benefits or the other ecosystem services that go along with our carbon project they're not there because of the carbon project, they're there because of my management actions as a landholder. And there's a big split there, and it does get a bit dangerous when you start tying these ecosystem services and co-benefits to the carbon project and saying they're there because of the carbon project. Fundamentally disagree with that, because they're there with the management actions of the land. That's a proactive landholder doing the right thing. So if you want to pay them for those ecosystem services, co-benefits, do they need to do a carbon project? They're doing them anyway. You know, then you can start getting around that problem of walking into, like, I don't know, when I used to do consulting, a number of times I went into a property, and by the time you drove from the front gate and had a conversation with the landholder for 5 minutes, you knew you were going to have this very awkward conversation and say, mate, you're doing a fantastic job, this is great, but you're not going to get set. So, you know, that's really got to be addressed. I think that, you know, hopefully what the pathway of doing that now.
Well, Gary, in 10 years, will farmers be sitting around yarning about the spot price of carbon credits today, the carbon trading and emissions tracking and income from ecosystem services, be just another day in the office for Aussie farmers?
No, I'm not sure if we will go to that amount of detail, but absolutely, I think carbon farming, but more broadly, delivering ecosystem services will become business as usual for producers. And, you know, our hope is that they're fairly compensated for it, and we think it's heading down that line. But certainly, you know, we can also see a case where it's just become a social license to operate. You know, not sure if you're going to earn a premium for the product, but the customers are going to demand it. And it's better, you know, we would view that it's better to embrace it, try to get what you can out of it. Because absolutely 10 years time, that's the future we're in.
All right, well, I'd like each one of you to wrap up with 3 things that you want the audience to take home and think about. Off you go, Gary.
Look, I think the starting one is that carbon's, it's a great financial opportunity for producers, but it's just one of an emerging range, and we think it's the start of an ongoing trend. Maybe the second one is it doesn't have to be as hard as it appears, and you know, you don't have to spend 5 years doing it, but it does come with a certain amount of risk that you need to be careful and aware of, and definitely enter with your eyes open. And maybe the third one is, well, you know, it's never been a better time than this to become a carbon farmer.
Great, Naomi.
So I guess the first thing that I'd like to say is that I think this is going to play a significant role in agriculture generally being able to improve its standing globally in terms of social license to operate. And so, you know, we will benefit by getting on board with this. The second thing that really sits quite prominently with me in my role is we need to commit as an industry to learning and building our capacity to engage in carbon in the same way that we would any of the other products that we grow on our land, and to see it as an integrated part of your business and your production system. Get comfortable with it, get familiar with it in the same way that you would, you know, the genetics in your herd or the planting cycle of your crop. And my third point is that it's actually really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be in agriculture, and it's something that we need to, you know, embrace and not be so scared. James,
And I've got yours written down here if you forget them.
What do you, it's a level of trust you don't get very often, isn't it? No, I haven't forgotten. I've changed, anyone?
Yeah, Gary's third one was different.
Yeah. I'd say, look, you really got to understand that this is, it's a massive opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity for a generation of producers to really get cash flow positive. There hasn't been a lot of good news stories out of agriculture for the past 20 years. This is going to change it. But it's about, you've just got to be smart, and you've got to match your find the opportunity for your farm, and you probably need to accept it might not be carbon, it might be biodiversity, it might be forestry, it might be runoff, it might be any number of ecosystem services, but you need to be aware of the markets, to be aware of how to maximise the return on that opportunity. Second one, I suppose, is you don't get caught in the weeds. Go down the carbon rabbit hole, and I did it, and I've seen a couple of producers do it, where they just get so lost, they take their eye off the ball, and they'll ring you and say, have you ran it yet? Oh, no, I haven't ran it. Well, you know, you still got to do your day job, you know, you still got to, you know, it's probably a bit different if you're a large company and you've got the capacity to take that stuff on, but for the day-to-day producer, it's a delicate balance to get it right. And there we go.
I knew that'd come in handy.
Yeah, you did, didn't it? And yeah, look, I think yeah, a better engagement from government and the carbon industry with the agriculture industry, you know, because that's really key to getting this right, because everyone's got a story about carbon projects gone wrong. Everyone's heard them. There's not as if it's not real, you know. There's still no industry-written methodology with the regulator, which is, you know, 20 years after it kicked off, so it's surprising, I'd say. So, yeah, I think I'd just encourage everyone to not only, you know, to look into the opportunity for yourself, you know, think of it from the industry point of view and what you can contribute to the growth sector.
Well, thank you to our three guests today, Gary, Naomi and James, and now I'm going to throw open to the floor for questions, but while the mics find hands that are up in the air, how about a round of applause for Al?
Questions, anyone?
Got our mics out there? One out there, we've got one down here, right over there, thanks.
Hi, Sally Boardman here from Sunny Spot Farms, northeast of Toowoomba. James, mostly for you, I was just wondering, I'm curious to know, do you have any say in or information on or knowledge of who you are selling your carbon credits to? And if so, are you investigating what they are doing with your credits, or are they actually changing some of their systems to be a better manufacturer, a better whatever industry they're in? And do you take that into account when you're looking at that?
Yeah, so under our structure, originally I would have no knowledge of who was sold or how it was sold. I'm very good at upsetting people and making a lot of noise, so my carbon company now does listen to me when I say, who the hell did you sell to, what was the price? I can say, don't sell. It's a lot different to what it was, you know, probably 5 years ago, but it just comes down to being, you know, quite demanding. It's probably what the kids get it from, I suppose. But as to what they do with the credits, no, I don't know what exactly, I know the company, I don't know what they're exactly offsetting it against.
Okay, got one down here, and can we get a mic down here later too?
Kathy Schnitzling from Landline, and I have to say that this Sunday we've got an interview that Pippa's done on blue carbon, and we'll be following up next week with a story on other farmers who are getting into the carbon market and how they've set up a co-op to deal with sharing information and maintaining profits. But this is a question that came out of something that James said, which was consumers will expect it. They won't pay for it, they will just expect it. So to Naomi and James, would you welcome the day when consumers can walk into a supermarket with an app on their phone and scan whatever that product is that our farmers have created, grown, and it will tell them about their involvement in the carbon market and how they've managed it and what the ecosystem services that they offer? Would you welcome that day?
Most definitely. I think transparency in our production system is going to be key to maintaining markets and maintaining customer trust. I mean, we don't have that technology yet, but customers are already asking those questions, and they're already doing that research, and they know what they're buying, and they don't want to pay for sustainability. It is an expectation. Around 70% of people will say that climate neutral food is important to them. Only about 3% will say that they'll actually pay for that. So it is very clearly an expectation, and it's one that they're following through on with understanding the products that they're buying and making choices on that basis.
Colin Boyce, MP. I'd like to hear some comment from Gary and James on behalf of Agricultural Australia for you to suggest that agriculture needs a social licence to operate and exist. I good luck to selling that one, is what I would say. That's my comment. How, Gary and James, are you measuring carbon content in the soil in terms of starting at a base point and arriving at whatever carbon credits you've managed to acquire, and how are you measuring that carbon content effectively, economically, and with any accuracy?
I'll maybe start with that, if that's okay, James. So, as I mentioned before, projects are done in terms of a detailed set of rules, methodologies. Those methodologies are overseen by the Clean Energy Regulator. And for soil carbon projects, there's a very detailed set of rules about how the measurements are undertaken. So that involves going onto site, doing randomized soil samples, and then sending those off to a lab. And very detailed rules about how the samples are randomized, how many you need to take, what statistical analysis needs to be done, etc., etc. And from that, we can be pretty confident that we're getting good, accurate measurements of soil carbon. The downside is it's super expensive, and especially when you do it across large properties, and then that leads to $128 million. The upside is, over time, those techniques will improve, and we will see technology make a difference. And certainly, the firm I'm involved in, we do work to take those samples and then to correlate them to other things that are easily measured or easier to measure, such as remote sensing data. And that's kind of the work, the evolution, tying on-the-ground samples back to data that can be collected more easily, and building models that are accurate, that still meet statistical tests. Now that's a work in progress, but over time, we are almost certain to get to the point where those costs will come down, the measurements will come down, but maintaining a good level of certainty.
Well, just on the social licence, I suppose the way I sort of look at it is it's been required, whether that's from consumer demand, as Naomi alluded to, or the international regulations, like the central banks are putting these regulations through, filtering through to our banks. As one banker said to me, if we do not have these systems in place, in 10 years you will not get finance. Like, not to pay more, you will not get finance. The problem is the framework for the farmer to use barely exists. The only one that actually even comes close in the country is the AgForce AgTech platform. So we have the social licence, we just got to demonstrate. So we are doing good things, farmers are doing good things. It's about getting the framework out there to prove it. And once we prove it, I believe we'll be right, telling that story. And soil carbon, we don't do soil carbon, we measure in trees. There's a really fundamental problem with soil carbon. It's written in the 2021 methodology. No one likes to talk about it. It says cannot have forest or forest potential. That rules out it's about 70 million hectares of Queensland that's not eligible. So it's fantastic. 1 hour drive from Canberra and Melbourne, where the universities are, and they love talking about soil carbon. Very, very really doesn't really apply in Queensland. And this is probably, it comes down to the regulator not engaging with industry groups, because industry says you've got to change it, you've got to change it. There is very legitimate reasons to change it. We can even prove it under additionality, like it should not say those words, but it does. So, I wish people would stop hailing soil carbon as this wonderful thing. Like, it might in 10 years when the technology catches up and they can ground through stuff, it'll come there. It might be more under an avoidance thing linked to ground cover than actual sequestration. But the reality is the bulk data for actual soil carbon across Queensland, until someone like AACO does a project, we just don't have it.
Well, thank you. That's all we have time for. Please put your hands together for our three fabulous
Thank you, and great to see nearly 300 people for our first event for the year. That's fantastic after the last couple of years the club's had. I think probably driven by our topic and our panel as much as anything, so thank you, panel. I hope you can see your club committee works hard to provide a balanced forum for the discussion. We do have quite robust discussions at committee level to make sure we get a variety of views across. I think today really demonstrated that. So I think hopefully, like me, you've got a bit of clarity out of what sometimes are confusing but exciting topics. So if you join me in thanking Pip, Gary, Naomi and James for a very entertaining and useful discussion. We have, as usual, a small gift as a token of our appreciation, which includes the scarf for the ladies and the famous Royal Press Club tie for the gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Before everyone leaves, we'd like to again thank our sponsors, Panelists, Sun Super and Colliers Agribusiness. We'd like to also thank Rachel and the SAS group for the event management of today's lunch. As always, an excellent job. And thank you to the Pullman for hosting us today. Again, before everyone goes, I'd really like to let you know that we've locked in our March speaker. So we're happy to announce that on the 17th of March, we'll be hosting our Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce. Please look out for the invitation, which will be sent out tomorrow. And we look forward to seeing you at our next